In the quiet corridors of Wellington University, Lin Wu moved like a shadow. Not because she tried to be invisible, but because after 15 years as the research librarian, she had mastered the art of blending in. Her footsteps barely echoed on the polished floors as she pushed her cart of returned books, nodding politely to passing students who rarely noticed her beyond a quick smile of acknowledgement. At 42, Lin had the kind of face that appeared younger from a distance but revealed the gentle lines of life's challenges up close. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes were chosen for comfort rather than style. Simple blouses and practical slacks that wouldn't catch on bookshelves or ladder rungs. The gold-rimmed reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck completed her librarian image. But there was nothing ordinary about Lin's mind. "Ms. Wu, could you help me find this journal article?" A frantic undergraduate waved a scribbled citation in front of her. "Professor Thompson said it's essential for my thesis, but I can't locate it anywhere in the database." Lin glanced at the messy handwriting and immediately recognized the reference. The Steinberg paper on quantum fluctuations? That was published in an obscure German journal before they digitized their archives. She smiled at the student's surprised expression. "Follow me." The young man trailed behind her as Lin navigated the library's basement level with the confidence of someone who could walk it blindfolded. She stopped at a section few students ever visited, running her finger along dusty spines before pulling out a bound volume. "Page 127, she said, opening it precisely to the article in question. "Would you like me to request a scan for your digital files?" "How did you even know where that was?" the student asked, genuinely impressed. Lin just shrugged. "It's my job to know." What she didn't say was that she had read the paper herself years ago, along with thousands of others across multiple disciplines. The library wasn't just her workplace. It was her sanctuary, her informal classroom, her window to worlds she had once dreamed of joining. Back in her tiny office, Lin took a moment to sip her tea and glance at the single photograph on her desk, a faded image of herself as a young woman standing outside Beijing University, clutching a stack of books and beaming with hope. She had been top of her class then, a mathematical prodigy who could solve equations that confounded her professors. "You have a gift," her mentor had told her. "A truly beautiful mind." That was before her father's sudden illness, before the family savings disappeared into hospital bills, before she had to abandon her doctoral program to care for her parents, before immigration to America, with nothing but 2 suitcases and a mathematics degree she couldn't use without further education she couldn't afford. Lin traced the edge of the photo frame with her fingertip. No regrets, she reminded herself. She had a good life, a stable job, and access to all the knowledge she could ever want. If sometimes she solved complex equations in her apartment late at night, scribbling on a small whiteboard until dawn broke, well, that was her private joy. The library intercom crackled. "Ms. Wu, please report to conference room B. They need assistance with the audiovisual setup for the mathematics symposium." Lin tucked a stray hair behind her ear and straightened her blouse. The annual mathematics symposium was the university's prestigious event, bringing together brilliant minds from across the country. Her role was purely logistical, making sure presentations ran smoothly, refreshments were stocked, and visiting professors found their way around campus. Conference room B had been transformed for the occasion. The usually bland space now featured elegant table settings, a podium with the university logo, and a massive whiteboard spanning one wall. University staff were arranging name tags and welcome packets as Lin entered. "Oh, thank goodness," the events coordinator sighed when she spotted Lin. "The projector isn't connecting to the laptop and Professor Jenkins is due to present in 20 minutes. Lin nodded and moved toward the audiovisual equipment. Professor Richard Jenkins was the symposium's star attraction this year, a Fields Medal winner whose recent work on nonlinear differential equations had made waves in mathematical circles. Lin had read his papers, of course, finding them brilliant but occasionally flawed, in ways only someone deeply versed in certain obscure theorems might notice. As she knelt to examine the connections, voices drifted in from the hallway. "Absolutely groundbreaking approach, Rich," someone was saying. though I'm still not convinced about the application to quantum systems. That's because you're thinking too conventionally, Tom, replied a deeper voice with the confident tone of someone unused to being questioned. The beauty of my method is precisely that it breaks free from traditional constraints. Professor Jenkins entered the room, surrounded by a small entourage of admiring colleagues. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confidence that came from decades of academic success. His gaze swept the room without registering Lynn's presence. "Is everything ready?" he asked the coordinator. "I'd like to review my slides before people arrive." "Almost, Professor. We're just fixing a technical issue." Lynn had already identified the problem, a simple driver incompatibility, and was quietly installing the necessary software. The projector flickered to life, displaying Jenkins' opening. "Slide. There we go," the coordinator said as though she had fixed it herself. "Will you need anything else, Professor?" Jenkins waved dismissively. "Just ensure the coffee is hot and the markers for the whiteboard are fresh. I plan to demonstrate some concepts beyond my slides." Lynn gathered her things and stood to leave, but paused when her eyes caught the equations on the projected slide. There was something not quite right in the third line, a small error in the application of a theorem that would affect the conclusion. She hesitated, wondering if she should mention it. No, she decided, it wasn't her place. She was the librarian, not a mathematician. Besides, someone of Jenkins's stature would surely catch the mistake before his presentation. "You," Jenkins suddenly said, looking directly at Lynn. "Are you with facilities?" Lynn shook her head. "I'm from the library. I was just helping with the projector." "Well, since you're here, could you make sure there's extra water at the podium? The speaking always leaves. My throat parched." "Of course," Lynn replied, her voice quiet but clear. As she arranged water bottles at the front of the room, she couldn't help glancing again at the whiteboard. Someone had written several complex problems on it, presumably challenges to be discussed during the symposium. One in particular caught her eye, a particularly thorny differential equation that seemed familiar somehow. Her mind began to work on it automatically, the way other people might absently hum a familiar tune. By the time she finished with the water, she had mentally mapped out 3 potential approaches to the problem. The room was beginning to fill with attendees. Distinguished professors in tweed jackets mingled with eager graduate students, all wearing name tags that listed impressive institutions. Lynn slipped toward the exit, intending to return to her library duties, but the events coordinator intercepted her. "Could you stay and help serve coffee during the breaks? We're short-staffed." Today, Lynn nodded agreement. She found herself stationed behind a refreshment table at the back of the room as Professor Jenkins began his keynote address. Despite herself, she was drawn into his presentation, mentally noting both its brilliance and its occasional logical leaps. The error she had spotted earlier went uncorrected. Several times Lynn almost raised her hand when Jenkins invited questions, before remembering her place. She wasn't registered for the symposium. She wasn't part of this world. She was here to pour coffee and collect empty cups. During the mid-morning break, Lynn moved quietly among the clusters of academics, refilling coffee cups and picking up discarded napkins. Fragments of intense discussion floated around her, still unsolved after 3 years. Tried applying Jung's method, but it breaks down at the boundary conditions. Could revolutionize our understanding if someone could just crack that central equation. She realized they were discussing the problem written on the whiteboard, the one that had caught her attention earlier. Apparently, it was something of a famous challenge in the field. As Lynn gathered empty cups onto her tray, she found herself standing near the whiteboard. Up close, she could see evidence of multiple attempts to solve the equation, faint ghosts of erased work around the margins. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the smooth surface, her fingers itching for a marker. "Admiring our little puzzle?" Lynn turned to find a young professor watching her with mild amusement. His name, Tag identified him as Dr. Chen from MIT. "It's an interesting problem," she said simply. "Interesting? It's been driving the department crazy for months," he laughed. "Jenkins assigned it to his graduate students as a growth opportunity. but none of them have cracked it yet. Some of us think he can't solve it either but won't admit it. Lynn nodded, politely, and continued collecting cups. But her mind was already turning over possible solutions, examining and discarding approaches, remembering a paper she had read years ago by a little-known Chinese mathematician whose work on Yi. Similar problems had been largely overlooked by Western academics. By lunchtime, she had mentally mapped out a complete solution. As the attendees filed out to the dining hall, Lynn found herself alone in the conference room. The whiteboard with its challenging equation seemed to call to her. It would be inappropriate, she told herself. This wasn't her symposium, her problem to solve. She was just the librarian who happened to be helping out today. But as she straightened the chairs and tidied the refreshment table, Lynn kept glancing back at that whiteboard. The elegant solution she had constructed in her mind deserved to exist in the world, not just in her head. Perhaps, just this once, she could step out of the shadows. She picked up a fresh marker, hesitated for one final moment, then approached the board. The department gathering Lynn's hand hovered over the whiteboard, marker poised to make the first mark when the conference room door swung open. She quickly stepped back, nearly dropping the marker as Professor Jenkins and 3 other mathematicians entered, deep in conversation. Still say your approach overcomplicates the issue, a woman in a navy blazer was saying. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Rivera from Princeton. Professor Jenkins laughed, a sound that managed to be both hearty and dismissive. Overcomplicates? Mathematics isn't about finding the simplest root, Elaine. It's about elegance. Lynn quietly placed the marker back on the tray and busied herself with rearranging the water bottles. Her heart was pounding, though whether from the near discovery or the lost opportunity she couldn't tell. The refreshments person is still here, Jenkins noted, finally noticing Lynn. Could you bring more coffee? The dining hall selection was abysmal. Of course, Lynn replied, grateful for the excuse to leave. As she slipped out, she heard Jenkins addressing his colleagues. Now, about that equation. I've been considering a novel approach using a modified version of. The afternoon session of the symposium was even more crowded than the morning. Word had spread that Jenkins was going to address the infamous impossible equation that had been frustrating the department for months. Extra chairs were brought in to accommodate the overflow of interested mathematicians. Lynn stood in the back corner, coffee carafe in hand, watching as Professor Jenkins took center stage. His confidence was magnetic as he gestured toward the whiteboard where the challenging equation remained prominently displayed. Many of you have heard about this little puzzle, he began, drawing appreciative chuckles from the audience. My graduate students have been wrestling with it all semester, and I've seen at least 3 different approaches attempted by faculty members. He paced in front of the board, tapping his marker against his palm. Today, I thought we might tackle it together as a community exercise. Who would like to suggest an opening approach? Hands shot up across the room. Jenkins pointed to a young professor in the front row. Have you considered applying the Zhang transformation to the left side? The young man suggested eagerly. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. A reasonable starting point. He wrote a few symbols on the board, then shook his head. But you'll quickly run into the boundary problem that has stymied everyone else. Another professor spoke up. What about treating it as a multivariable system and solving iteratively? More notations appeared on the board. Lynn watched, fascinated, as the collaborative attempt unfolded. Each suggestion contained insights, but also critical flaws. The room's energy began to shift from excitement to frustration as approach after approach dead-ended. Perhaps we should move on to the next topic, suggested Dr. Rivera after nearly 40 minutes of failed attempts. We could return to this when. Just a moment, Jenkins interrupted, his pride clearly stung by the suggestion of abandoning the problem. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Lynn, still standing quietly with her coffee carafe. A small, unkind smile touched his lips. Let's get an outside perspective, he said. You there, refreshments lady? The room fell silent as all heads turned toward Lynn. She felt heat rising in her cheeks as Jenkins continued. You've been watching us struggle with this all afternoon. Perhaps you'd like to take a crack at it? His tone made it clear this was meant as a joke, a moment of levity to break the growing tension in the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirked, expecting either embarrassed refusal or, more entertainingly, a completely misguided attempt that would restore their sense of intellectual superiority. Lynn stood frozen, her mind racing. This was humiliation disguised as inclusion, and everyone knew it. The sensible thing would be to politely decline and continue with her duties. Yet the solution she had constructed earlier still burned in her mind, elegant and complete. I couldn't possibly, she began, her voice barely audible. Nonsense, Jenkins insisted with exaggerated encouragement. We're all colleagues here, don't be shy. The falseness of his collegiality was painful to hear. A few audience members stared at their laps, embarrassed by the display. Dr. Rivera frowned slightly but said nothing. Lynn carefully set down her coffee carafe on the refreshment table. Time seemed to slow as she walked to the front of the room, each step feeling both terrifying and somehow inevitable. The marker Jenkins held out to her felt impossibly heavy as she took it from his hand. Standing before the whiteboard, Lynn took a deep breath. The equation stared back at her like an old friend waiting for recognition. She had solved versions of this in her apartment late at night, working through similar problems just for the joy of the mental exercise. Take your time, Jenkins said, his voice dripping with condescension. Or feel free to admit defeat. No one would blame you. Lynn uncapped the marker. Her hand trembled slightly, but her mind was clear. She began to write, starting not with the conventional approaches the professors had attempted, but with a transformation based on the work of that obscure Chinese mathematician she had studied years ago. The room grew quieter with each symbol she added to the board. The initial smirks faded, replaced by furrowed brows and then widening eyes as mathematicians began to recognize the unconventional but undeniably sound approach unfolding before them. Lynn lost herself in the problem, forgetting the audience, forgetting the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. There was only the equation and the solution flowing through her like a clear stream. Her handwriting, initially shaky, grew confident as she progressed, filling the board with elegant derivations. When she finally circled her answer and stepped back, the silence in the room was absolute. 50 pairs of eyes moved between the original equation and her solution, checking, verifying, and finding no flaws. Professor Jenkins stood with his mouth slightly open, his expression shifting rapidly between disbelief, embarrassment, and the reluctant recognition that only a true mathematician could give to an elegant proof. It was Dr. Rivera who broke the silence, rising from her seat to approach the board. She traced a finger along one section of Lynn's work, then turned to face the room. This transformation here, she said, pointing to a critical step. I've never seen it applied this way. It's brilliant. She turned to Lynn. Where did you learn this approach? Lynn swallowed hard. Finding her voice felt more difficult than solving the equation had been. There was a paper, she said softly, by Professor Huang from Beijing University, published in 1987. It wasn't widely circulated in Western journals. You've read Huang's work? Asked an older professor from the back row, clearly impressed. His papers are notoriously difficult to find, even for those of us in the field. I work in the university library, Lynn explained. I read a lot. You're a librarian? Dr. Rivera asked, surprise evident in her voice. Lynn nodded. For 15 years now. Jenkins had finally recovered his composure. Well, he said, clearing his throat. This is certainly unexpected. It's more than unexpected, Dr. Rivera corrected, a note of excitement in her voice. It's revolutionary. This solution opens up possibilities for applying similar approaches to an entire class of differential equations we've been struggling with. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Where there had been condescension, there was, now, genuine curiosity. Mathematicians were taking photos of the board with their phones, discussing implications among themselves, and casting wondering glances at Lynn. A young graduate student raised her hand. Could you explain your thinking? On that third step, the way you handled the boundary condition is unlike anything I've seen before. Before Lynn could answer, Professor Jenkins stepped forward, clearly attempting to regain control of his symposium. I think we've taken enough of a detour for one afternoon. We should move on to the scheduled presentations. Actually, Dr. Rivera interjected, I'd very much like to hear more about Ms. She paused, realizing she didn't know Lynn's name. Wu, Lynn supplied. Lynn Wu. Ms. Wu's approach, Dr. Rivera continued. Perhaps she could elaborate during the discussion period after the next presentation. Other professors nodded in agreement. Lynn felt lightheaded. After 15 years of academic invisibility, suddenly these distinguished mathematicians wanted to hear her thoughts. I'm not registered for the symposium, she pointed out. Consider yourself my guest, Dr. Rivera said firmly. That is, if you're willing to share more of your insights. Lynn looked around the room at the expectant faces, then back at the equation she had solved, the visible proof of the mind she had kept hidden for so long. A strange feeling bubbled up inside her, something between terror and exhilaration. It felt remarkably like hope. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I'd be happy to. As she walked back to her place at the refreshment table to wait for the discussion period, Lynn noticed something had changed. People moved aside to let her pass, nodding respectfully. A few whispered among themselves, glancing her way with newfound interest. The library cart and book dust seemed very far away now. For the first time in 15 years, Lynn Wu had been seen, truly seen, for who she was. And nothing would ever be quite the same again. The afternoon sun slanted through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Lynn sat in a chair that someone had insisted she take, still feeling strangely disconnected from reality. Her hands rested in her lap, no longer needed for serving coffee or organizing papers. Instead, she was listening to a presentation on computational approaches to fluid dynamics, aware of the occasional glances directed her way. The presenter, a young professor from Caltech, kept stumbling over his words whenever his eyes met hers, as if the knowledge of what she had done earlier made him nervous. Lynn found this both amusing and uncomfortable. Just hours ago, she had been completely invisible to these people. When the presentation ended and the discussion period began, Dr. Rivera stood up. Before we continue with questions about the fluid dynamics model, she said, I believe many of us are still processing the remarkable solution Ms. Wu provided earlier. She turned to Lynn. Would you be willing to explain your approach in more detail, particularly the transformation you applied in the middle steps? All eyes turned to Lynn. Professor Jenkins, sitting stiffly in the front row, wore an expression that suggested he had bitten into something sour, but everyone else looked genuinely interested. Lynn rose and walked to the whiteboard, where her solution still remained. The marker felt natural in her hand now as she pointed to the key section of her work. The traditional approach hits a wall here, she explained, her voice gaining confidence with each word. Western mathematical tradition tends to attack these problems directly, but there's an alternative perspective in Professor Huang's work that suggests rotating the entire framework. As she elaborated, drawing additional diagrams and equations, to illustrate her points, Lynn felt a sense of homecoming. This language of symbols and relationships had always been where she felt most herself. The words flowed easily, as if she were simply having a conversation with a friend about a shared passion. The beauty of this method, she concluded, is that it doesn't just solve this specific problem. It opens a doorway to addressing an entire category of differential equations that have similar boundary constraints. When she finished, there was a moment of silence followed by a burst of questions, not polite, patronizing questions, but urgent, excited inquiries from mathematicians who recognized the significance of what they were seeing. Have you published any papers on this approach? Could this be applied to quantum field equations? Do you have other examples worked out? Lynn answered as best she could, explaining that no, she hadn't published. And yes, she believed the method had applications in quantum mechanics, though she would need to work through the specifics. I don't understand, said a gray-haired professor from Stanford. You clearly have an extraordinary mathematical mind. Why are you working as a librarian instead of doing research? The bluntness of the question brought a hush to the room. Lynn felt her cheeks grow warm. How could she explain the complex tapestry of circumstances, choices, and necessities that had led her here without sounding like she was asking for pity? Life takes unexpected turns, she said simply. I came to this country with a mathematics degree but no money for further education. The library position offered stability when I needed it most. She paused. But I never stopped doing mathematics. I just did it in private. Dr. Rivera shook her head slowly. What a waste of talent. No, Lynn corrected gently. Not wasted, just waiting. As the discussion continued, Lynn became aware of Professor Jenkins whispering intensely with the department chair in the corner of the room. Their glances in her direction suggested she was the topic of conversation, and Jenkins's agitated hand gestures indicated he wasn't pleased. When the session finally broke for the day's closing reception, Lynn found herself surrounded by mathematicians eager to continue the conversation. Business cards were pressed into her hands, email addresses exchanged, and invitations extended to various research groups and seminars. Ms. Wu, the department chair, Dr. Thompson, approached her. He was a tall man with kind eyes that contrasted with his formal demeanor. Could I have a word with you in private? Lynn excused herself from the group and followed him to a quiet corner of the room. Professor Jenkins stood waiting, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. First, Dr. Thompson began, I want to apologize for the manner in which you were called upon today. It was inappropriate and not reflective of the values of our department. Jenkins studied the floor, saying nothing. Second, Thompson continued, I'd like to discuss your future. A mind like yours doesn't belong in the stacks of the library, unless that's truly your passion. Lynn blinked, uncertain she understood his meaning. My future? We have a visiting scholar position opening next semester. It includes teaching one undergraduate course and pursuing independent research. Given what I witnessed today, I'd like to offer you that position. Lynn felt as if the floor beneath her feet had suddenly disappeared. A position in the mathematics department? Teaching? Research? The dreams she had carefully packed away years ago were suddenly being handed back to her, unwrapped and shining. I don't have a doctorate, she stammered. That can be addressed in time, Thompson replied. Your demonstration today was worth more than many of the dissertations I've reviewed over the years. Jenkins finally spoke, his voice tight. It's highly irregular. There are protocols, applications, committees. Sometimes, Richard, Thompson interrupted, we need to recognize when our systems fail to capture exceptional talent. Ms. Wu should have been identified and supported years ago. He turned back to Lynn. Think about it. We can discuss details later this week. As Thompson walked away, Jenkins remained, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. I suppose I owe you an apology, he said at last, the words clearly difficult, for him. Lynn studied his face. There was embarrassment there, certainly, and wounded pride, but also a reluctant respect that hadn't existed hours earlier. Your solution was impressive, he admitted. I've been working on variations of that problem for months. Thank you, Lynn said simply, choosing not to dwell on his earlier cruelty. Life had taught her that holding on to grievances only added unnecessary weight to an already challenging journey. Jenkins nodded stiffly and walked away, back straight and shoulders tense. The reception continued around her, but Lynn felt the need for quiet. She slipped out of the conference room and into the empty hallway, leaning against the wall to steady herself. The events of the day swirled in her mind like leaves caught in a whirlwind. There you are. Dr. Rivera appeared in the hallway. Are you all right? Lynn nodded. Just a bit overwhelmed. I can imagine. Rivera leaned against the wall beside her. It's not every day your life changes course so dramatically. Do you think it has? Lynn asked, surprising herself with the question. Changed course, I mean. Don't you? Rivera looked at her curiously. After what happened in there? Lynn considered the question. For 15 years, she had lived a life of quiet routine, finding her joy in private moments with mathematics and books. There had been comfort in that simplicity, in the lack of expectations or scrutiny. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything other than a librarian anymore," she confessed. "The academic world. It's been so long." "May I ask you something personal?" Rivera's voice was gentle. Lynn nodded. "When you were solving that equation today, how did you feel?" The question caught Lynn off guard. How had she felt? She closed her eyes, remembering the moment. "Free," she said finally. "I felt completely free." Rivera smiled. "That's how you know it's your true path, when the work itself liberates you, even under pressure." They stood in silence for a moment, the muffled sounds of the reception filtering through the closed doors. "Whatever you decide," Rivera said at last, "don't let fear make the choice for you, and know that you have allies now." She handed Lynn a business card. "I'm speaking at Princeton next month. I'd love to have you come as my guest, meet some colleagues there." After Rivera returned to the reception, Lynn remained in the hallway, turning the business card over in her fingers. Through the window opposite, she could see the library where she had spent the last 15 years of her life. The familiar building looked somehow different now, as if she were seeing it from a great distance. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor. "Everything okay? Reception running late?" Lynn stared at the message, suddenly aware that her old life was still waiting for her, unchanged by the dramatic events in the conference room. Tomorrow, she could return to her desk, her cart of books, her quiet routine. She could pretend today had never happened. Or she could step forward into uncertainty, into a world that had both dismissed and then recognized her, a world of intellectual challenge and, yes, sometimes cruel judgment. A world where her mind could finally stretch to its full capacity after years of careful containment. The choice was entirely hers. Lynn took a deep breath and began typing her reply, each word a step on a new path forward. 3 weeks later, Lynn stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of a new blouse she had bought specifically for today. The reflection that stared back at her seemed both familiar and strange. The same face, but somehow altered by recent events. Perhaps it was the way she held herself now, shoulders a little straighter, chin a little higher. "You can do this," she told her reflection, though her stomach fluttered with nerves. Today was her first day as a visiting scholar in the mathematics department. After much thought, she had accepted Dr. Thompson's offer, arranging to work part-time in the library while transitioning to her new role. The university had been surprisingly accommodating once they understood the unusual circumstances. Her small apartment looked different this morning, too. The whiteboard that had previously been hidden in her bedroom now hung proudly on the living room wall, covered in equations related to her first research project. Books that had been carefully stored in closets now filled her bookshelves. Advanced mathematical texts she had collected over the years but kept private, as if they were secrets too revealing to display. Lynn gathered her notes, carefully organized, in a new leather folder, a gift to herself to mark this new beginning. As she locked her apartment door, Mrs. Chen from next door emerged with her garbage bag. "Off to the library?" the elderly woman asked with a smile. She had been Lynn's neighbor for nearly a decade, always friendly but never intrusive. "Actually, I'm heading to the mathematics department today," Lynn replied. "I've accepted a new position there." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mathematics. I always thought you worked with books, and I did. I still do partly." Lynn smiled. "But now I'm also teaching and doing research in mathematics." "Well," Mrs. Chen exclaimed, "you're just full of surprises, aren't you? Congratulations." Walking across campus felt like traversing between worlds. The familiar path to the library branched off toward the science buildings, and Lynn took the less familiar route, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. Students hurried past wrapped in their own concerns, unaware that the quiet librarian they barely noticed was now transforming into someone new. The mathematics department occupied the third floor of the science building, a maze of offices and Classrooms with walls lined with obscure theorems and inside jokes only mathematicians would understand. Lynn's new office, shared with two other visiting scholars who hadn't yet arrived for the day, was small but filled with light from a large window overlooking the campus quad. She set her things on the empty desk assigned to her, running, her fingers over the smooth surface. A computer hummed softly, already set up with her university credentials. A small placard on the desk read, Lin Wu, Visiting Scholar. Seeing her name displayed this way brought an unexpected lump to her throat. Knock on the open door startled her. Dr. Thompson stood there, a friendly smile on his face. Good morning, Ms. Wu. Or should I say, Professor Wu. Lin is fine, she said quickly. I'm not sure I'm used to professor yet. Well, you'd better get used to it. Your undergraduate differential equations class has 25 students enrolled already, and the drop-add period isn't even over. He handed her a folder. Here's your final schedule and some departmental information you'll need. Your teaching assistant will meet you this afternoon. Teaching assistant? Lin echoed slightly, dazed. Just weeks ago, she had been shelving books and helping students find journal articles. Now she had her own TA? Standard for all our faculty, Thompson assured her. Though I should warn you, you've become something of a legend among the graduate students since the symposium. I believe there was actually competition to be assigned to you. Lin felt her cheeks grow warm. That's flattering, but unnecessary. I haven't proven anything yet beyond solving one equation. Sometimes that's all it takes, Thompson said. One moment that reveals what you're truly capable of. He checked his watch. Faculty meeting at 11 in the conference room. Nothing formal, just a chance to meet everyone properly. And Lin. His expression grew more serious. Don't let Jenkins intimidate you. He's still adjusting to the situation. After Thompson left, Lin unpacked her materials, carefully arranging books and notebooks on her desk. As she worked, other faculty members stopped by, some she had met at the symposium and others who were new to her. Each greeted her with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth. So you're the library mathematician, said one older professor with a thick Russian accent. Very good, very good. We need more unconventional thinkers. Too many clones these days, all saying the same things, proving the same theorems. He shook her hand firmly. Come by my office later. I have books you will find interesting. By 11 o'clock, Lin felt as if she had met more people in one morning than in the past year at the library. She followed the flow of faculty members to the large conference room where the meeting would be held, hesitating at the entrance. The room was already half full. Mathematicians clustered in small groups, conversations flowing about research, students, and department politics. This was the same room where 3 weeks ago she had solved the equation that changed her life. Now she was entering not as catering staff, but as a colleague. She spotted Professor Jenkins at the far end of the room, deep in conversation with two other professors. He glanced up, saw her, and gave a curt nod of acknowledgement before returning to his discussion. Not friendly, but not openly hostile either. Progress, of a sort. Lin, over here. Dr. Rivera waved from a group near the windows. Lin made her way over, grateful for the friendly face. How's the first day going? Rivera asked. Overwhelming? A bit, Lin admitted. Everyone's been very welcoming, but it's a lot to take in. You'll find your rhythm, Rivera assured her. Oh, I've been meaning to tell you. I shared your approach to that equation with some colleagues at Princeton. There's significant interest in your work. We're organizing a special session at the next American Mathematical Society meeting, and we'd love to have you present. Lin blinked in surprise. Present at the AMS meeting? But I don't have a proper paper yet. You have until January to prepare one, Rivera said, and I'd be happy to help you navigate the submission process. As the faculty meeting began, Lin found herself seated at a large table surrounded by mathematicians whose papers she had read and admired for years. Dr. Thompson introduced her officially to the department, highlighting her unconventional path and fresh perspective as assets to their community. And, he added with a smile, she's already demonstrated an ability to solve problems that have stumped some of our best minds. A ripple of good-natured laughter moved through the room, though Jenkins's smile looked rather fixed. After the meeting, Lynn headed to the small campus cafe to gather her thoughts before meeting her teaching assistant. She ordered a green tea and found a quiet corner table, opening her new folder to review her class roster. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted. "Are you Professor Wu?" Lynn looked up to see a young woman, probably an undergraduate, clutching a textbook to her chest. "Yes," she replied, still not quite used to the title. "I'm in your differential equations class," the student said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I heard about what happened at the symposium, how you solved that impossible equation when you were just there serving coffee." Her eyes were wide with admiration. "Everyone's talking about it." Lynn felt a mixture of embarrassment and pride. "I wasn't just serving coffee," she corrected gently. "I was working in the library and helping with the event, and mathematics has always been part of my life, even when it wasn't my job title." The student nodded eagerly. "That's even more inspiring. I'm struggling with deciding on my major. I love math, but everyone keeps telling me to choose something more practical." She hesitated. Seeing someone who found their way back to what they love even after years, it helps. As the student left, Lynn sat with her tea, turning the conversation over in her mind. Already her story was spreading, transforming in the telling like a mathematical proof being refined with each iteration. She wondered what elements would be emphasized, what details would be lost, what meaning others would find in her unexpected journey. That afternoon, she met her teaching assistant, a serious graduate student who treated her with such deference that Lynn had to stifle a laugh. They reviewed the course syllabus together, discussing problem sets and grading policies. The familiar material grounded Lynn, reminding her that beneath all the recent changes, her connection to mathematics remained constant and true. At 5 o'clock, Lynn packed up her things, nodding goodbye to her office mates who had appeared mid-afternoon. As she left the building, she realized she hadn't thought about her old routine at the library all day. Her mind had been too full of new challenges, new possibilities. Crossing the campus in the golden late afternoon light, Lynn felt the weight of her previous life lifting with each step. The path forward wasn't clear yet. There would be obstacles, doubters, moments of uncertainty. But for the first time in 15 years, she was walking in the right direction. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Rivera. "Dinner tomorrow. To discuss your research plan? Several colleagues interested in collaborating." Lynn smiled as she typed her reply. "Yes, thank you for everything." As she reached the campus gates, she paused and looked back at the buildings where her two worlds now existed. The library that had sheltered her, and the mathematics department that was welcoming her home. Both had their place in her story. Student rushing past bumped into her, breaking her reverie. "Sorry, Professor," he called over his shoulder. Professor Wu. She was going to have to get used to that. 1 year later, the lecture hall buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled and people stood along the walls clutching notebooks and pens. A much different scene from the library where Lynn had spent so many quiet years. She took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone clip to her jacket as she glanced at the clock. 2 minutes until she would step onto the stage for her keynote address. "Professor Wu?" A student volunteer appeared at her side. "They're ready for you." Lynn nodded, gathering her tablet and notes. The past year had been a whirlwind of change. Her transition from librarian to mathematician, now complete in ways she could never have imagined on that fateful day at the symposium. The American Mathematical Society's annual conference was one of the most prestigious gatherings in the field, attended by thousands of mathematicians from around the world. Being invited to deliver a keynote was an honor typically reserved for established scholars with decades of work behind them. Yet here she was, about to present her groundbreaking paper on boundary value problems using the approach that had stunned the room a year ago. As she walked onto the stage, the applause washed over her like a wave. She spotted Dr. Rivera in the front row, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. Several of her students from Wellington University were scattered throughout the audience, their faces bright with pride to see their professor in this moment. "Good afternoon," Lynn began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "Thank you for that warm welcome." She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, all attentive. A year ago, the thought of speaking to such a large group would have terrified her. Now it felt almost natural, like an extension of the work she loved. My talk today is titled Hidden Symmetries, a new approach to boundary value problems and differential equations. But before I delve into the mathematics, I'd like to tell you a story about hidden things. The audience settled in, intrigued by this unconventional opening. Sometimes the most powerful ideas remain hidden, not because they wish to be secret, but because no one thinks to look for them in unexpected places. Lynn paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the room. A year ago, I was serving coffee at a mathematics symposium when a professor asked me to solve an equation as a joke. A murmur rippled through the crowd. By now, many had heard versions of her story, but few had heard it directly from her. What he and others didn't know was that I had been solving such equations in my apartment every night for 15 years. After finishing my shifts at the university library, mathematics was my first love, my private joy. But circumstances had led me down a different path. As Lynn continued her presentation, weaving her personal journey with the mathematical concepts she had developed, the audience leaned forward in their seats. Her approach to mathematics, influenced by both Eastern and Western traditions, by years of reading widely across disciplines without the constraints of academic specialization, offered something genuinely new to the field. When she concluded, 45 minutes later, the applause was thunderous. The Q&A session that followed was lively, with mathematicians from various specialties seeing applications to their own work in Lynn's methods. As the session ended and people began filing, out of the hall a small group gathered around Lynn at the podium. Among them was an elderly Asian man whose name tag identified him as Professor Huang from Beijing University. "Professor Wu," he said, his voice quavering slightly with age. "I never imagined that my obscure papers from the 1980s would find such brilliant application. You have taken those early ideas and developed them far beyond what I could have envisioned." Lynn felt a surge of emotion as she shook his hand. "Your work was the foundation, Professor Huang. I wouldn't be here without it." No, he insisted with a gentle smile. "You would have found your way. Minds like yours always do eventually." Later, at the conference reception, Lynn found herself in conversation with a group of young women mathematicians, all graduate students from various universities. They had sought her out specifically, drawn by her unconventional path. "Did you ever doubt yourself?" asked one student, her question direct but her eyes uncertain. "During those years in the library, did you wonder if you were good enough?" Wines considered the question carefully. "Every day," she admitted. "But I also knew that my love for mathematics was real, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. The equations didn't care about my credentials or lack thereof. They responded to understanding, to insight." "What would you say to someone who feels out of place in this field?" asked another student. "Someone who doesn't fit the traditional mold?" Lynn looked around the elegant reception hall at the clusters of mathematicians engaged in animated conversations. "I would say that mathematics needs diverse perspectives to grow. Every field does. The traditional paths exist for good reasons, but they aren't the only valid ways forward." As the evening progressed, Lynn spotted Professor Jenkins across the room. Unlike a year ago, he nodded to her with what appeared to be genuine respect. Their relationship had evolved into a cautious collegiality over the months. He had even cited her work in his recent paper, perhaps the sincerest form of academic acceptance. Dr. Thompson approached, champagne glass in hand. "Congratulations on a brilliant keynote, Lynn. The university is already receiving inquiries about you from other institutions." He lowered his voice, "including offers for endowed chair positions." Lynn raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I'm happy at Wellington, and we're thrilled to have you." Thompson assured her. But your star is rising quickly. I'd be remiss not to mention that you'll have options. Later that evening, Lynn escaped the crowded reception for a moment of quiet on the hotel's rooftop garden. The city lights spread out before her like a constellation of earthbound stars. She thought about Thompson's words, about the opportunities now opening before her that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mrs. Zhou, the elderly woman who had taken over Lynn's old position at the library when Lynn transitioned to full-time faculty. Found these notes in an old book being returned. The message read, accompanied by a photo of equations scribbled in familiar handwriting. Yours? Reminded me of how you used to leave. Math problems on sticky notes everywhere. Lynn smiled, remembering how she had once hidden her passion in plain sight, jotting down equations and tucking them between books like secret messages to herself. Now her work was published in prestigious journals, discussed at conferences, taught. In classrooms she typed back, "Yes, from my library days. Keep them if you want. A souvenir from the past." The door to the rooftop opened and Dr. Rivera stepped out. "There you are. They're about to announce next year's Fields Medal nominees." The Fields Medal, mathematics' highest honor, awarded every 4 years to exceptional mathematicians under 40. Lynn had never even dreamed of being in consideration. "Come on," Rivera urged. "Whatever happens, you deserve to be there for the announcement." As they walked back together, Lynn reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. From a young math prodigy in China, to an immigrant working in a university library, to a respected mathematician giving keynote addresses. Each chapter of her life had seemed disconnected from the others until that day when Professor Jenkins had asked her to solve an equation as a joke. She had never been the joke. She had only been waiting for the right moment to reveal the brilliance she had carried silently for so long. Back in the reception hall, Lynn rejoined her colleagues as the chairman of the International Mathematical Union stepped up to the microphone. The room quieted in anticipation. "The committee is pleased to announce the nominees for the 2026 Fields Medal." As names were read and polite applause followed each, Lynn stood quietly, content regardless of the outcome. She had already received the greatest prize, the freedom to be fully herself, to contribute her unique perspective to the field she loved, to inspire others who might otherwise remain hidden. When her name was announced among the nominees, the room erupted in applause. Dr. Rivera squeezed her arm in excitement. Former students cheered. Even Professor Jenkins joined in the applause, his initial skepticism long since transformed. But in that moment of recognition, Lynn thought not of the accolades or the potential medal, but of all the other hidden brilliance, still waiting to be discovered in unexpected places. The janitor with a gift for engineering, the cashier with an ear for music theory, the bus driver who solved physics problems between routes. Her story was just one among countless others. But perhaps it could help open doors, challenge assumptions, and remind the world that extraordinary minds exist everywhere. Sometimes serving coffee, sometimes shelving books, sometimes solving impossible equations when finally given the chance.